It's a real pleasure to be with you. Hutchinson is just one of those great non-metro success stories in the state. You have so much going on here that is positive. Um, from the manufacturing base to the overall business base, it just creates incredibly high quality of life. I hope with my presentation today, I can contribute in some small way to the future success of Hutchinson, because I just think it's one of the shining stars in Minnesota, and I'm really happy to be here. So we're going to talk about succession planning for business ownership today, and it's an interesting topic. I'm here as a lawyer. I'm here as somebody who's been advising businesses for a long time, both large and small. But it is decidedly more than a legal discussion, because we're talking about human psychology, essentially, because we're talking about money and the connection between human beings and money and the legal aspects of business succession and business ownership are all part of this. And so you will hear a mixture of legal advice. You'll hear some stories that I think are instructive, because those stories lead to how legal advice has to be translated into actual action and interpretation by human beings within the context of human relations, and particularly families. I come from a family of 5. I love my 4 siblings. My parents are deceased. But even with those so-called normal relationships, there's dynamics that have to be taken into account. And so I'll touch on all of that as we go forward. So let's see. I'm going to be a little funky here in the beginning. So this is the agenda for today. I'm going to touch on these 5 topics: initial considerations for succession planning, how succession planning can impact a business, because there's a broader impact just beyond the business. It goes into the community. I'm going to get into 2 what I hope are highly instructive examples where succession planning, even on a sophisticated level, didn't go so well, but I think there's some lessons to be learned. Steps for building a strong succession plan, strategies for identifying future leadership, and that's in kind of an art more than a science, and best practices for ensuring continuity during leadership change. So I hope those strike you as relevant. And as we go along, if there's something that really hits you and you're just burning to ask the question, feel free to do so, because I think if you have the question, certainly other people in the room are likely to have the question as well. So, initial considerations. I'll move my notes as well. Sorry for the clunkiness of it. So whenever somebody comes to us with, we'll get this eventually, sorry. Whenever somebody comes to us with this challenge of smooth succession planning, we really have to find out exactly what the ownership is. Most small businesses are held in an LLC. Typically, those are 1 or 2 member LLCs. But then along the way, I would say my experience is no more than 50% of the small business ownership owners pay attention to corporate formalities. So they may say, a loyal employee may say, well, I'm going to make you an owner, or you get 5% of it, and then never follow through on it. And so one of the things that we have to do initially is find out who actually owns the business, because through history, it often is not a very it's not a very clear answer to that question. in addition, sometimes as businesses grow, you get into, say a 30-person manufacturing firm that's doing maybe 10 or $15 million of business. You may have separate classes of ownership. So you may have common shares, you may have preferred shares, and each of those classes of ownership come with different rights. Some may have common shares, non-voting rights, that kind of thing. The other thing that comes about with different class ownership is who gets dividends, who has a right to say whether the business can get sold. And so that is a kind of a tricky thing to figure out. And so the other thing that we see very often in manufacturing is that owners will at some point split the real estate with the actual manufacturing operations. And so that gets messy. And then with each of those asset classes, you can have varying types of ownership. So just figuring out who owns the business, and then parenthetically, where does the power to change the business sit? So once that gets sort of meted out, then we can decide about this issue of succession planning, because oftentimes we see things like a husband and wife will say, okay, let's start a business, and then it'll be 50-50. And then life goes on. There may be a divorce, there may be a death. Same with any, say, partners that might start a business in that manner. Because initially you say, okay, we're in this together, let's just do it 50-50. It's very complicated if you go downstream and everything is 50-50, because then you really need unanimity over anything that the business is going to do, including passing on the business. And so just understanding what those dynamics are critical for an initial consideration. Yeah, and again, how the business is organized. Is it an LLC? Is it a partnership? Is it something different than that? So we just get a baseline for where the ownership sits, because then you have to figure out who has to give approval to any succession plan that you may have going forward. And then now we get into this business of non-legal. No matter how close relationships are, money changes people. So I'll just give you a little personal example. So I'm the son of two typical World War II parents. When I turned 18, my parents said, "You're an adult. Please go out in the world, figure out your life. Parenthetically, don't come back." In fact, when I left for college, I came back, my mother rearranged my room. All my stuff was cleared out. So at least symbolically, it was, we love you, but you don't live here anymore. Figure it out. Which I, in fact, did on some level. But so then little education, little hard work. You go out, all of a sudden I had $1,000 in my checking account. I'd never had $1,000 in my checking account. And then I started thinking, what would $2,000 in my checking account look like? And so too, I give you that as an example, not to, delve into my youth, but to say, just expand that. And how do you react? How does your family react to money? How do children react to money? How do siblings react to money? Because some people, I think most people, they've got a governor on this instinct. But then there's some people that don't. And so that has to be in the background of this whole succession planning thing, is where are you going to, and what structures are you going to put into place to deal with this issue of the psychology of money? And I'll talk a little bit more about it at the end, but I wanted to bring this up because all the planning in the world, all the legal planning in the world, won't matter unless you have in the back of your mind something that will address this issue of irrational greed, of people who go through life where enough is never enough. And that can wreck a business. And so I just plant that seed for you to think about that as we go through the tools to de-risk the succession planning process. But nevertheless, it's not going to be risk-free because of this very issue. And so in my view, based on lots of examples and lots of experience, planning is essential, and planning really helps. And so we'll get into how we execute on that. Don't ever rely on Dad always said I would get the business. And I say that generically because you know how this works. You know, somebody said something to somebody long ago, and then it just becomes an assumption. But if it's not written down, if it's not clear, if it's not framed out, if the expectations of other people who are affected by this expectation are not made clear, are not communicated with in a timely or a regular basis, this is where kind of the trouble, if you will, or the ambiguity starts. And then this can lead to lots of other things that are not good on a business level or on a human level. I think it's necessary to document an agreement on clear and understandable family values. So I'll ask this throughout. One of the things about being in business is, especially when it comes to succession planning, because succession planning implies that there's something to pass on, which implies you have been successful. You've gone through that period of high risk. You've gone through that period of borrowing money at the bank, where the bank has taken a chance on you. You may have taken out a small business loan. You don't have customers. Certainly you don't have cash flow. And then all of a sudden, you've gotten through that. And you are in fact making money, and you are in fact taking dividends and a regular paycheck from the business that you've created. And so when there's something to pass on, then you have to start being very clear about documenting what that looks like. And I think it starts with a value statement, because a value statement is like a constitution. It's like a framework that you default to for unanticipated situations. So if you're in business, maybe you're in business to make money, pure and simple. There's no altruism. There's no grander purpose. There's no huge societal effect by it. But you just want to be in business and live a normal life. And so that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But maybe you're in business because you want to improve the world. Maybe you want to improve your industry. Maybe you're an essential supplier and you just like the value, the inherent value, which I personally believe in, the inherent value of work. And you want to contribute to the community. You want to grow a community like Hutchinson. And so there's broader values. Maybe you want to feed your extended family or have opportunities for your extended family. That too is a great value. But whatever those values are, and part of the thing that we do, and along with, there's coaches for this, so we're certainly not the only source of this kind of, but to sit down as an organization, as senior owners, and that may include family who's not owners, and ask the question, what is important to you? What is important to us? Why do we get out of bed in the morning? And once you identify those things, this whole business of things like irrational greed start to kind of take care of themselves, because you as a family, you as owners have agreed to these values. And there are certain behaviors that are either in or out of that framework of values. This planning is not going to take care of everything. And so a value statement coupled with the legal documents, that's a pretty good approach to dealing with succession planning. But this value statement about what you are all about, almost as people. So let's take an example. You could say something as simple as, we believe in hard work, and we believe in rewarding hard work. And you'll see how even that simple thing that people generally agree with comes into play in an example that went really, really bad, because they didn't believe in something that was that simple, that obvious. That is, people getting rewarded for non-meritorious behavior. So anyway, a value statement is really critical, and I think should be written down. And then reaffirming it, communicating, doing the basic things that being treated, particularly in the areas of money and wealth and inheritance and implicitly power, how you would want to be communicated with it. Where do I stand? How do I fit into this overall structure? Particularly if you have, larger families. My family was 5. For a family in New Ulm, that was kind of a small family. Lots of times you had 8, 9, 10 kids. Several of my classmates had 13, 14 kids. I mean, that's just the way it was. But how each of those kids feel will depend upon how they were dealt with in terms of communication. So reaffirming this, meeting and communicating accurately, truthfully, honestly, and not sugarcoating it is also part of an initial consideration for this. Let's see. Backwards here. So when you talk about succession, you naturally talk about, who's going to be part of the emerging organization, and who is not. Within a large family, you're going to have people who are all over the map. People will say, I don't want anything to do with showing up at, a smelly, greasy garage and working on a CNC machine. I don't want anything to do with that. I want to, join the Peace Corps, do something. And there's others that will get into it, that they'll love the challenge of it, that they'll love the creativity that's behind manufacturing, that may be behind selling. And so figuring out where those dynamics sit is critical going forward, because each one of those cases will have to be dealt with differently. And that's a big challenge for, let's say, parents who started a business and are successful, and then you're sitting there and you generally love your kids, but then you've got to figure out this whole issue of what is fair. What is fair is not the same thing. What is fair typically gets translated by money. So if you want one thing and there's 3 people, not all 3 are going to get that one thing. And figuring that out, and it can be figured out with the right narratives and the right tools, so that at the end of it all, people, generally speaking, with the framework of values that they buy into, will be satisfied and life can go on with normalcy. I like what's bolded here in terms of value. Merit combined with compassion and gratitude is a healthy starting point. Who can argue with this? But some people can. If somebody is going to be treated differently because one person worked hard and one person didn't, they are going to be receiving something different. But if you bought into merit as a value, it's understandable. If you never talked about merit, if you are under the assumption as a child that, okay, I'm just as equal as anybody else in my family, and you haven't even talked about the implications of merit, then you're going to feel cheated if in fact you are not treated the same. And so this is where you connect the value statement with the ultimate succession. And like I said, at some point, enough has to be sufficient and not redefined as much as you can get. Now, let me talk about a couple of examples. So this is interesting. And I'm going to talk about, my two examples are one from irrational behavior side of a child slash shareholder, and the other one is treating a shareholder poorly. So from the management side. So I hope these are instructive. So Upshur Smith, I don't know, has anybody ever heard of this story? This is really interesting. And you just keep peeling it back and back and back. But anyway, it goes something like this. Native Minnesotan pharmacist in the early 20s started fooling around with generic drug formulations, passed it along to the second generation, then passed it along to third generation, and became this very successful generic drug manufacturer in Plymouth, Minnesota. So third generation manager, owner, they're thinking of constantly this tension between selling versus expanding. But in any event, it has a value roughly of $1 billion. There's 4 kids in the business. It reached that value because one of the sons was taken over by the second generation, succeeded the second generation dad, and created a bunch of value, new formulations, lower manufacturing costs, all the typical ways you do this. And so it's at $1 billion. There's 4 kids. You guys do the math. Each kid has $250 million of net worth. Now, that's not exactly true, but it's close. Along the way, there was a compensation plan put in place where the CEO's son was to get a little bit more if he achieved certain profitability goals. Typical comp. Merit, right? For the daughter who had got married, moved to Texas, married, and living life, she comes home from Thanksgiving, and so the son gets like 1% or 1.5%. Anthony, I think it's about right. Not much. The father announces to the daughter that because the older brother created this value, his share amount is going to go up maybe 1%. She doesn't want anything to do with that. She wants to be treated fairly. And again, I'm tying this back to what I said about merit. So she sues. And, ultimately the business goes down in value. There's some resolution to it because under Minnesota's minority shareholders laws, you can force a sale. And in fact, a sale was forced. And so I'm sure she got somewhere between $200 and $250 million. But then the sad part of this all is that she stops talking to the entire family. She's got 3 kids as well with her husband. And so there's grandchildren involved. Soon after this was announced, and she announced she was going to sue the family because for some reason she felt she was being treated unfairly, the father gets sick and dies. And so there he is creating all this wealth, all this value for not only the employees, but for this very closely held corporation, these major shareholders. And there was no word spoken until he passed away. And there was no word spoken. Their relationships were completely fractured because of this, in my view. And I don't, what do I know? I was just reading it, but it was fairly well documented because there's so many lessons to be had. There was all these relationships were permanently fractured because $250 million wasn't enough. And so I'm sure they had sophisticated advisors. You get to this level, you got lots of lawyers, lots of accountants, lots of people talking to you about how to structure this. But for this one, large owner, 250 wasn't enough. And then for some reason, the calculus in that shareholder's mind was, I'm going to sue, try to get more at the expense of this whole family relationship dynamic. And so this is an example of when you don't temper that instinct, this is what, in fact, can happen. The second example is relative to Lund's grocery store. So I think most of you know what Lund's and Byerly's is. It's a high-end grocery store in the Twin Cities. I don't know, maybe a dozen or so outlets, but profitable, roughly 600 million in sales. And so the story here is that one of the children was a teacher for 30 years and was fundamentally uncomfortable with wealth. But all of her wealth, the net worth, was based in Lund's Byerly's shares. And so she went to the CEO, her brother, and said, I want out. And he basically, stiff-armed this whole conversation. There was a bunch of arguments about there was a huge deficit relative to a union pension fund that was $50 million. Her shares, there was this, question of value of her shares. Could have been 20, could have been 15, could have been 50. Nobody really knew, but there wasn't a reasonable solution to what she wanted, and that is she wanted the money and wanted to unlock so that she, in fact, could give it away according to her own values. Perfectly reasonable, and nothing wrong with that. But the brother would have had to made these arguments saying, well, 600 million in sales, groceries are really thin margins. Maybe they were cashing 28 million or so after tax year in, year out. But in order to satisfy buying out her shares and paying this union deficit, this pension deficit, they would have had to borrow $100 million. So there was a fundamental business issue in place that was part of the discussion. But as far as the shareholder is concerned, the union deficit wasn't her making, so she wasn't to blame at all. But there was no accommodation. There was no saying, okay, I understand what you want. Please understand the business issue. We'll give you $5 million a year until you get your full value out of your shares, and we can deal with full value by having a business valuator give us or two of them give us numbers and averaging them out, which is typically how it's done. But instead of that, the CEO brother said, just a hard no. Well, then she had to sue all the shareholders under Minnesota's minority shareholder statute, and then ultimately won. And her shares were valued at $45 million, which was a lot. And when she started it out, you could tell it was a lot, that there was some multi-million-dollar value that she wanted to simply spend as she wished, but there was just no appetite for accommodating what ultimately was a fairly reasonable request. And so I would just say parenthetically that when somebody is an owner, particularly in Minnesota, they have very defined rights, and you have to listen to those requests. Whatever they are, as long as they're reasonable, you have to listen to those requests of the minority shareholders. And so ultimately, there was long litigation. There was lots of expense on attorneys. I'm sure both sides spent in excess of $1 million fighting this thing. It went up on appeal and then was ultimately affirmed by the Minnesota Supreme Court. And within that opinion, there were several comments about how fractured the family was, because ultimately, when you go in your corners and then there's the emotion of family connected with it. People just are not in a mood to compromise. And this is example one of what happens when people take extreme positions. And then again, same as the Upshur-Smith example, you have these dramatic fracturing of family relationships, and then ultimately huge expenses that I think are completely unnecessary. So impacts. Um, Obviously, transition. There's lots of constituencies when it comes to succession planning. Employees, people who have created value, and so I think when you think about passing on a business, you want to do everything to avoid what I say here is deathbed planning. So building a strong succession plan. Besides the value statement, you certainly want a governance and structure, a governance structure that fits completely into the estate planning. So whatever your bylaws and whatever your articles of incorporation say, you want to make sure that you get very, very detailed in terms of what your estate planning says, who gets the shares, who gets voting shares, who gets non-voting shares, and there's methods for dealing with ownership that avoids a lot of this. There's something called phantom shareholders, which essentially you get the economics of shareholder ownership, but you don't have the voting power, which goes at how you could affect the transition of the corporation. And so the point here is that you want to marry those two, and you don't want to say, oh, the corporation is just fine, my lawyer's taking care of it, and then you've got an estate planning lawyer, and those two don't talk. So you really want to marry those together, because again, if you're talking about kind of more than one shareholder, you've got individual circumstances that need to be taken into account. And like I said previously, the value statement, I think, go part and parcel with all of the legal documents, because they lay out the important considerations, particularly for people who are not going to participate in the business for whatever reason. The way we've seen this happen most consistently is through succession planning councils, or call it whatever you want, a family council. And it's where, you sit down at least once a year, and depending upon how big the numbers are, it might even be quarterly, might be monthly, but you sit down with the shareholders once a year, look each other in the eye, reaffirm those values, and then talk about the business. As business owners, nothing is a given. This is why I admire business owners so much. You wake up every day, you need the cash flow, you need customers, you need sales. You're dealing with all the minutia of hiring and evaluating people. It's an organic, living thing that needs attention. And the pluses and minuses of how a business is doing should be talked about in a fairly transparent manner with the people who are shareholders. And it builds a culture of cooperation. It builds a culture of support. But without the communication, you really are creating a risk long term, because people will fill in the blanks if they're not communicated with. And so we see this, could be a couple of hours once a year, could be half a day. Some families, they go kind of on a retreat thing for 2 days, and they lay this all out, and there's social time in between. There's reintroduction, there's reaffirming of the family, all this kind of thing. But the family council really is the overall structure. And sometimes If somebody's got a high net worth, sometimes they bring their own lawyers to these things. That's always a little clumsy. And so to the extent you could make it a business meeting as well as a human relationship building, that's pretty good. And, you know, to be clear about, who has the right to do what going forward. Because if somebody doesn't participate in the business, they're going to sit there and say, okay, I've got 5% shareholders. What does that really mean? Do I got a right to dividends? Do I have a right to demand dividends? This kind of thing. And so just clarifying kind of what the legal landscape is one of the really important functions of these family gatherings and family councils. So it's also critical throughout here to manage the expectations and avoid any perception, to the extent you can, of favoritism between potential stakeholders. And again, within the context, I don't mean to belabor the point, but within the context of a family, particularly once you get down to the second generations, you're dealing with first cousins, potentially third, you got third cousins. They may not even know each other. And so just to have sort of a kind of a human understanding of each other, and this is where the social interaction really mitigates a lot of the perception of favoritism, I think is very, very important. The second bullet point here, I mean, it's amazing what people fight about. And everything here, they will fight about this, particularly the cabin. Particularly the cabin. Now, in Minnesota, we've kind of dealt with this. There's something called a cabin trust, where you can put the cabin in a separate legal entity called a trust, called the cabin trust, and it will dish out certain rights to the people who have used it or want it, or whoever owns it wants access to. So there's ways of dealing with it. I mean, look, if you've got two siblings that don't get along, they are not going to that cabin together. Yet they're relatively equal and maybe want to be treated equally. And so this cabin trust is a really effective tool for dealing with it. But like I talked about, when you've got three people and only one thing, that's a difficult thing. And so this is what happens when you have dishes and heirlooms and your great grandmother's jewelry or rings or paintings. All this stuff is part of the mix, and there are tools to deal with it. But believe me, succession planning can often get tripped up on these things as well. And if you go back to a value statement where people aren't going to be treated equally, but they'll be treated fairly, this will take care of, that statement will take care of this issue as it comes up. Absolutely critical to have the right professional advisors. This is just the reality of it. Attorneys, accountants, financial planners are a really important part of the mix. I've come to really appreciate the voice and expertise of the financial planner in this whole thing. Tax advising is really critical. And so it's certainly a layer of expense as you go through this, but I think it's absolutely worth it if you want to de-risk the future of your business. So minority shareholder rights, I mentioned this before in one of the examples. Minnesota has really, really strong minority shareholder rights. You can't ignore them. And to the extent that they want to see things like compensation plans, they want to see books and records, they want to see the profit and loss statement, they want to see cash flow, they want to see the balance sheet. They've got a right to it. And then ultimately, and this again, I'm tying all these themes together the best I can, this is where communication comes in. If somebody says, oh, I see you've got $1 million on the balance sheet, I want 1/3 of that because I'm a 1/3 shareholder. Well, no, child number two, you don't get 1/3 of the cash in the balance sheet because that has to buy equipment for next year. And if we don't buy equipment, then we're not going to continue the business. So they've got to understand basic financing, which sometimes can be part of the family council. What's the difference between return on invested capital and net cash flow at the end of the year? Can they read a balance sheet? Do they know things like banking relationships? What are the terms of the loan? How can it be stepped up? What's a leverage ratio? What's a price to earnings ratio of your shares when they were previously evaluated? Financial education is a really, really big thing, and can oftentimes avoid the horror stories. But at the end of it all, if the minority shareholder doesn't feel like they're being treated fairly and doesn't want to participate, they can force a sale of their shares. And so this gets into the area of making very sure you know who are your shareholders and how are they going to react. Are they going to be supporters? Are they going to be dissenters? Are they going to understand the organic nature of a business? Because at the end of it, the laws in Minnesota give them a very, very big stick, and that is to sell their shares. And in the case of the Lund situation, it hurt the business by having to borrow that money to cash out the shareholders, let alone what the expense was to litigate all that stuff. And so just be aware that that's out there and that ultimately minority shareholders can't be ignored. Identifying future leadership. This is also something that the succession council or family council can deal with. I think there should be plans, at least outlines in terms of what would happen if the founder leader passed away or was incapacitated in some way. This happened very famously. I don't know if you're familiar with Christensen Farms in Sleepy Island, Minnesota, one of the biggest pork producers in the country. Their CEO passed away, I think, on a hunting accident, and they were able to carry forward. But I've had another friend who ran a large road construction firm in Leavenworth, Minnesota, and that was a case where there wasn't a succession plan in place. They got kind of lucky because ultimately they were able to keep it going simply because the people were so loyal to the business. But you want to avoid the situation where you're relying on luck more than a plan. You have to think about, are there current employees that should be involved in leadership and leadership training going forward? And so this too can be done particularly with HR advisors as you think about the leadership. Try to respect your time here. As the leader, it's critical that you take an active role in this process, and to think about how the leader will deal with family members when hard decisions have to be made. I think that's the key when you're passing along a business, is to think about, do they have the right business savvy, and do they have emotional intelligence to deal with those issues? Because both of those issues will come up. And clearly in the case of the Lunds, my impression from a distance was they did not have the right emotional intelligence to deal with that. Fairly reasonable request. And this last point here, it's very reasonable to say, I don't want to pass on the business. Passing along a business is hard, it's complicated. I think it's implicit in the things that I've said. It's much easier to deal with cash than it is to all these puts and takes. A family council, managing the business, dealing with the ups and downs of the business, maintaining profitability, trying to pursue growth. It's a lot easier. Maybe it's easiest for peace within a family to simply deal with cash. And so the decision about not passing on a business is a very, very reasonable one. And oftentimes, people don't think about that because when they start a business, they work at it 30 years. There's a natural instinct to want to pass it along, but you've got to think about too, maybe selling is the best option, all things considered. So, I want to get to respect your time. I want to finish up with this in terms of perspective. Um, going back to what I said in the beginning, ask, as you discover the values of your family, of your business, ask the question, why are you in business? And if you don't have a clear answer for that, that triggers other discussions. It triggers other discussions with your employees, with whoever you founded the business with, because that's kind of your North Star, the reason why you get out of bed every day. And if that's ambiguous, then thinking about succession planning might not be the best thing for the future and for all your constituencies. Strongly encourage doing your best in terms of getting a perspective on succession planning, to learn about the psychology of money. And there are several books out there called The Psychology of Money. If you just look on Amazon, it's right there. And that is a critical piece of this whole discussion. And the third point, is there a person who does have that emotional intelligence that can deal with, the second cousin who never behaves well at family gatherings, who might be a shareholder for whatever reason? And finally, don't go it alone. There are people out there who will help you. I'm part of it, that kind of professional support that you can have and help through these very thorny issues. But you're not doing it alone, and there are answers to be had. And like I said, all this is meant, once you've made the decision to pass on a business, sort of de-risk that process. And to do that right, it takes several years. It doesn't happen overnight. And you certainly don't want to do it in the face of a crisis, particularly a health crisis, if that befalls you. So anyway, I'll stop there. Happy to take questions, and thanks very much for your time. I really appreciate it.